The next time you feel stressed because your food delivery is late, remember Ned. Remember that, somewhere in the past, people were dealing with plagues, famines, and the very real possibility of being sliced in half for forgetting to bow. Suddenly, our modern problems seem quite manageable. And that's today's lesson, straight from the worst eras in history. Life is hard, but it could be much, much worse. Now, take a deep breath. Relax your shoulders. Your biggest battle today will probably be deciding what to watch next on Netflix. And that, my friends, is a privilege worth being grateful for. I'm Ned. And this has been another Bad Moments. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a date with a shower and about 12 cheeseburgers. Sleep well. You deserve it. While my brain tried to process the sensory overload and my stomach fought a heroic battle against nausea, a different sound cut through the ambient cacophony. It was music. But not just any music. It was a scratchy melody, played on a stringed instrument that looked like it had seen more battles than many a night. And a voice. A loud, somewhat nasal voice, which wasn't singing, but rather, narrating. In the middle of a small crowd that had formed in a muddy square, a man stood on a crate. He was thin, wore a patched doublet of once vibrant colors, now faded by dirt and time, and had a battered lute slung around his neck. He was no concert artist. He was the medieval version of a 24-hour news channel. "Listen, good people of Bellisgard," he bellowed, stopping the melody for a moment. "I bring news from the south. The Baron de Montfort, that mangy dog, has tried once again to take the lands of our good Count of Toulouse. But our valiant soldiers repelled him at the bridge of Oriol." A murmur went through the crowd. Some men stamped their feet in approval, others spat on the ground in contempt at the name of Montfort. The minstrel, or rather, the street troubadour, continued his sung report. He spoke of a new salt tax imposed by the distant king, a rumor about an important bishop's illness, and, to ease the tension, a satirical song about a greedy miller who was tricked by his own wife. The people laughed, commented among themselves, absorbed every word. And there I was, on my knees in the mud, with my NASA sweatshirt and braces, having an epiphany. I was witnessing the internet of the Middle Ages. Slow, analog, powered by a lute and poor rhymes, but fundamental. In an era without mass printing, without radio, without fiber optics, that man on the crate was Twitter, the nightly news, and a gossip podcast, all rolled into one. He was the connection for that small, isolated village to the rest of the world. The information he passed along was, without a doubt, filtered, exaggerated, and probably paid for by someone. The song about the bravery of the Count of Toulouse? Pure propaganda. The joke about the miller? Perhaps a form of social control, a warning not to be greedy. But for these people, whose lives were confined to the cycle of the harvest and Sunday Mass, that minstrel was a window to a larger universe. He brought news of wars that might one day reach their doorstep, of policies that would affect the price of their bread, of scandals that would distract them from their own misery. He wasn't just entertaining. He was informing, shaping public opinion, weaving the tapestry of collective reality with the threads of his songs. He was a digital influencer, only with a much higher probability of dying from the bubonic plague. The man finished his performance with a dramatic flourish, passing a tattered hat through the crowd. A few copper coins clinked inside. He then stepped down from the crate, slung the loot onto his back, and began to walk, limping slightly, towards an alley even darker and less inviting than the main street. My survival instinct, which had been on its last legs for a long time, screamed at me to stay put, or better yet, to try the return spell and hope I didn't materialize inside a wall. But my other half, the masochistic history nerd, spoke louder. That man was my only source of information, my only potential guide in this labyrinth of mud and superstition. With a sigh of resignation that condensed all the laziness and bad temper in the world, I stood up. I wiped the mud from my pants, which only served to spread it around, and began to follow the walking newspaper. After all, what else could I do? I was a walking anachronism, a redhead with braces in an age when being a redhead was suspicious enough. Following the starving artist seemed, at the moment, like the least catastrophic plan. Little did I know that least catastrophic in the Middle Ages was still a level of danger that would make an action movie look like a picnic in the park. The adventure, or rather, the suffering, was just beginning. Following someone in the Middle Ages isn't like in the movies, where the hero hides behind marble columns and photogenic fruit stands. In reality, it's an exercise in olfactory stealth and biological obstacle avoidance. Every step was a gamble. Was that dark puddle just rainwater or something more organic? Was that pile of straw in the corner of the alley trash or someone's bedroom? I chose not to investigate. The man I was following, my Google Maps in a tattered tunic, walked with the familiarity of someone who had already tripped on every stone in that village. He didn't look back. Why would he? No one in their right mind would follow a broke street performer into the bowels of a place like that. Except, of course, a time traveler with terrible planning skills. That is, me. The alley opened into a slightly larger courtyard, dominated by a building that seemed to be the social mecca of the region, a tavern. The wooden sign, worn by time, showed a crude drawing of a smiling boar. Or maybe it was a pig with a toothache. The art was ambiguous. Greasy smoke and the sound of loud conversation and guttural laughter leaked from the door, which was permanently ajar. It was the kind of place that promised two things: watered-down ale and a reasonable chance of being stabbed over a game of dice. The minstrel entered without hesitation. After a moment of deep consideration of my terrible options, took a deep breath, an immediate mistake, and went in too. The impact was overwhelming. The air inside was a living entity. A dense mixture of fireplace smoke, sweat, spilled ale, roasted meat grease, and the unmistakable smell of wet clothes that would never truly dry. The place was dark, lit by a few tallow candles that dripped onto metal plates and by the large fireplace at the back, where a spit with something I hoped was a known animal turned slowly. The floor was covered in sawdust that, I suspected, wasn't there for decoration, but to absorb, well, everything. My musical guide was not greeted with applause. The taverner, a burly man with arms the size of my legs and a gaze that had seen it all, just nodded. The minstrel went to an empty corner, sat on a bench, and the taverner handed him a wooden mug and a piece of dark bread. It didn't seem like payment, but an exchange. Entertainment for sustenance. The life of an artist, universal in any century, apparently. I slipped to a table in the darkest corner, hoping my gray sweatshirt and panicked face would make me invisible. It worked for about 30 seconds. Then people started to notice. The looks weren't hostile, just curious. What was that strange fabric? And why on earth did I have shiny pieces of metal glued to my teeth? I gave a closed-mouthed smile and tried to look harmless, which, let's be honest, isn't hard for a nerdy redhead out of his natural habitat. Meanwhile, the minstrel, after devouring the bread as if it were his last meal, picked up the lute again. The noise in the tavern didn't die down. He simply began to play over the din, a livelier tune this time. No one stopped to listen. He was the background music, the tavern's Spotify playlist, only with far fewer royalties. It was then that I overheard the conversation at the next table. Two men, probably merchants judging by their slightly better clothes and hands that didn't look like they'd worked the land, were drinking their ale and speaking loudly to be heard over the noise. "Just look at our knot," one of them said, gesturing with his chin towards the musician. "Playing the same 3 songs about the harvest and lost love. If it weren't for his chicken impression, he'd have starved to death by now." The other laughed, a deep, joyless sound. "He's a jongleur, what do you expect? A trained monkey has a bigger repertoire. But he's good for drowning out the sound of the rats in the walls." The word hit me like a stone. Jongleur. That was it. My brain, the external hard drive of useless historical facts I carry in my head, clicked. I was seeing the bottom of the medieval entertainment pyramid. Arnaud, the man with the lute, was not a minstrel in the romantic sense of the word. He was a jongleur, a term that came from the Latin joculator, meaning joker or jester. And the way those men spoke of him, it was pure contempt. He wasn't an artist, he was a vagrant, a necessary evil, a disposable distraction. He was the guy who plays Wonderwall at the barbecue for the 10th time. Zero respect. And then, the first merchant leaned in, his voice lowering a bit, taking on a tone of admiration. "Now, if only the Count would bring Bernard de Vendadorn to the castle. I heard he was in the neighboring lands. Now that is music. That is poetry. His words, they say they can make a queen weep or a knight fall in love with his own shadow. Bernard de Vendadorn." The name echoed in my head. One of the most famous troubadours. And there was the other half of the equation. The crucial distinction that movies and novels conveniently ignore. The jongleur, like poor Arnaud, was the manual laborer of music. He was the musician, the singer, the acrobat, the storyteller. He traveled on foot, from village to village, from tavern to tavern, playing for food and a warm place to sleep. He was the disseminator of popular culture, but he was seen as little better than a thief. He was the low class of show business. The troubadour, on the other hand, was the elite. The word comes from the verb troubadour, to find or to invent. They were the composers, the poets. Often, they were nobles, knights, or even kings, like Richard the Lionheart. They didn't write about harvests, they wrote about fenimores, courtly love, or romantic and idealized code of conduct that was the height of sophistication. They composed complex political satires and moral debates in verse. Their art was for the refined ears of the court, not for the drunk patrons of a tavern. The troubadour was the creative genius, the acclaimed composer. The jongleur was the session musician, the hired instrumentalist to perform the work. Sometimes, a famous troubadour would have his favorite jongleur, who traveled with him and performed his songs perfectly. It was a symbiotic relationship, but the hierarchy was clear and brutal. One was the brain, the other, the mouth. One received honor and patronage. The other, if he was lucky, a coin and a piece of bread. I looked again at Arnaut, the jongleur. He had started telling a crude joke between songs. A few men laughed, most ignored him. He was the true cultural worker, the guy who brought the stories and the songs to the people, who kept the flame of narrative alive on long, dark nights. And in return, he received contempt. It was the fate of many popular artists throughout history, loved by the people, but despised by the elite who, ironically, depended on them to spread their own ideas. The merchant's conversation gave me a new, vital piece of information. The castle. The Count. A place where high culture happened. Where a real troubadour could be found. And, more importantly for my growling stomach and my body begging for a bath, a place with better food and, presumably, less mud on the floor. My mission changed. I no longer needed to follow the jongleur. I needed to get to the castle. The challenge, of course, was how. I couldn't just knock on the door. Hello, I'm a 21st century historian with a fascination for medieval music and an urgent need to use a bathroom that isn't a hole in the ground. May I come in? I would need a plan. A smart, subtle, well-executed plan. Or, knowing myself, I would probably do something stupid, trip over something important, and end up inside by pure accident. Either way, the castle looming on the hill, visible through the tavern's smoke, became my new objective. That was the next level of the game. And I had a feeling the enemies would be much more complicated than a grumpy taverner. My grand plan to infiltrate the castle was devised with the precision and tactical genius that only desperation and laziness can inspire. The plan was, walk to the main gate. Yes, that was it. My logic was flawless. In a world where everyone dressed in variations of brown and beige, a guy wearing a gray sweatshirt with a faded NASA logo and jeans would be so absurdly out of place that no one would know what to do with me. Could they arrest me? Maybe. Kick me out? Probably. But there was a small chance that pure, unadulterated confusion would grant me a few moments of access. It was the human 404 error tactic. I was such a corrupted file that the system might not be able to process me. The climb up the hill to the castle was a reminder that life before Uber was, in essence, an uninterrupted cardio workout. The stone walls, which looked majestic from a distance, were revealed up close to be crude, functional, and intimidating. 2 guards with conical helmets and spears stood at the entrance of the iron-reinforced wooden gate. They looked bored, which was a good sign for me. Boredom is the enemy of vigilance. I walked towards them with a confidence I definitely did not feel. I tried to adopt an air of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, like an apt delivery driver looking for the right apartment. One of the guards raised his spear, blocking my path. The metal tip stopped inches from my nose. "And who might you be?" he asked, his voice a disinterested grunt. I opened my mouth to answer, but my brain, in an act of comical self-preservation, completely forgot the few phrases of vulgar Latin I knew. Instead, the only thing that came out was a strangled sound, something between an and an irk. And to make matters worse, my nervous smile revealed the metallic glint of my braces. The guard blinked. He leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. "What's that, in your mouth? Silver teeth?" His companion, who until then had seemed to be sleeping on his feet, came closer to look. "Looks like a bear trap for fairies," he commented. I was about to be classified as a circus freak, which, honestly, wasn't the worst-case scenario. It was then that an older man, wearing the clean, black tunic of a steward or administrator, came out of the gate. He saw the scene, frowned, and approached. "What's going on here? Who is this individual?" "We don't know, sir. He doesn't speak. And he has metal teeth," the first guard said, as if that explained everything. The steward looked me up and down. His eyes, accustomed to assessing the value of grain and the honesty of merchants, landed on my sweatshirt. He didn't recognize the NASA logo, of course, but the fabric, the cut, it was unlike anything he had ever seen. Soft. No apparent seams. His expression changed from suspicion to cautious curiosity. Maybe I was a messenger from a land very, very far away. A land of magical weavers and sadistic dentists. "Did he come with the troubadour?" the steward asked, more to himself than to the guards. "Perhaps he's an exotic assistant. Master Falkett loves these eccentricities." He turned to me. "You. Come. And try not to bite anyone." And that's how my brilliant plan failed, and I got into the castle. I was mistaken for the roadie of a medieval rock star. I didn't complain. The interior of the castle was another universe. The courtyard was packed earth, yes, but it was free of the trash and mud of the village. There was order. Blacksmiths worked at a forge, the sound of their hammers echoing off the walls. Servants scurried about with baskets of laundry and buckets of water. It was noisy and busy, but it was a chaos with purpose. The prevailing smell was of hay, hot metal, and bread baking somewhere. 1,000% improvement. I was led across the courtyard, through a stone corridor, and finally to the pulsating heart of the castle, the Great Hall. And it was great. The dark wooden beamed ceiling rose to an impressive height, disappearing into the smoke that rose from the central hearth, a gigantic fire pit in the middle of the hall. Tapestries with hunting scenes and coats of arms covered the stone walls, helping to combat the cold and add a splash of color to the gray environment. At a long table elevated on a wooden platform, the Count, the Countess, and their retinue were dining. And in the center of the hall, on a small makeshift stage, there he was, the troubadour. And he was everything that poor Arnaut, the jongleur from the tavern, was not. He wore a dark blue velvet doublet, his clothes were clean and well cut. His hair was combed. He held a bowed viol, a much more refined instrument than Arnaut's battered lute, and he wasn't playing to an inattentive audience. He had the complete silence and attention of the hall. When he spoke, people leaned in to listen. He was a star. I leaned against a pillar at the back of the hall, trying to look as exotic assistant as possible. And then, the troubadour, Master Falkett, began his song. His voice was clear and powerful, and the melody was complex, far beyond the simple tunes of the tavern. But it was the lyrics that caught my attention. He sang of the recent battle at the Oriole Bridge, the same one the jongleur Arnaut had reported in the village. But this was a different version. It was the director's cut. In high definition. With commentary. The noble Count of Toulouse, lion of our land, sang Falkett, with 100 valiant men, a wall of faith. Saw the coward Montfort, with 1,000 vile mercenaries, crawling like a serpent, a wretched traitor. My historian brain went on high alert. This wasn't news. It was propaganda of the purest, most shameless quality. Arnaut, in the village, had merely reported the fact: a battle took place, and the Count's forces won. Falkett was creating a mythology in real time. In his song, the Count wasn't just a feudal lord defending his territory, he was a lion, a wall of faith. His soldiers weren't just men, they were valiant. The enemy, Baron de Montfort, wasn't a political rival, he was a mangy dog, remember, a coward, a serpent, a traitor. His 1,000 soldiers were vile mercenaries, devoid of honor. Arnaut said the Count repelled the attack. Falkett described the Count practically flying over the battlefield, his eyes shining with divine fire as the enemies fled in panic, tripping over their own feet. I looked at the Count at his table. He was eating a piece of chicken, but his chest was puffed out with pride. He nodded at the right moments, a small, satisfied smile on his face. That song was his payment. Master Falkett wasn't being paid with a piece of bread, but with gold, with patronage, with a place of honor at court. In return, he was the Count's public relations officer. He polished his patron's image, magnified his deeds, and, most importantly, destroyed the reputation of his enemies. That was the true power of a minstrel at court. He was a weapon. His songs, which would be learned and repeated by other jongleurs like Arnaut throughout the kingdom, were the medieval equivalent of a disinformation campaign. They could justify a war, solidify an alliance, undermine a rival's authority. Whoever controls the narrative, controls history. And in that hall, the microphone was firmly in the hands of the Count, through his talented and well-paid troubadour. The song ended with a triumphant flourish. The hall erupted in applause. The Count raised his goblet to Falkett, a gesture of maximum approval. The troubadour gave an elegant bow, the consummate professional. He had delivered what was asked of him, a hefty dose of ego for his patron and a poetic slander for the enemy. I was fascinated. It was like watching a political debate, only with musical accompaniment and much better rhymes. The power dynamics were clear, the transaction was obvious. but as Falkett stepped away from the stage, I noticed something that wasn't part of the show. He passed by the main table, and for a brief second, his eyes met the Countess's. She, who had seemed bored throughout the whole song, had a flash of intensity in her gaze. Her hand, which was resting on the table, moved subtly towards a linen napkin. Falkett, as he passed, brushed his hand against hers, an almost imperceptible movement. When he moved away, the napkin was no longer there. He had taken it. There was nothing accidental about that gesture. It was deliberate, silent, and, to me, deafeningly suspicious. The propagandist, the poet, the rock star, maybe he had another function. One that wasn't performed in the light of the fireplace, but in the shadows of the corridors of power. There are two types of people in the world. Those who, upon seeing a clear sign of danger, like a secret message exchange between a noblewoman and a traveling artist, turn around and look for the nearest exit. And then there are the idiots. And I, as always, was leading the committee of idiocy. My historian's curiosity is a chronic disease. It completely overrides my survival instinct, which is already quite precarious. That linen napkin. It was such a small detail, so insignificant in the grandeur of the hall, but to me, it shone like a spotlight. The spectacle of propaganda was the newspaper headline. That silent exchange was the footnote that contained the truth. And I needed to know what it said. Master Falkett, the troubadour, exited the hall with the same elegance he had entered, receiving pats on the back from minor nobles who wanted a piece of his shine. I waited a few seconds, trying to look casual, which resulted in a strange, half-crouched pose, as if I were about to get a cramp. No one noticed. The invisibility of the exotic assistant had its perks. I slipped out of the great hall, back into the colder corridors. Where would a medieval spy read a secret message? He wouldn't do it in the middle of a hallway. He'd need privacy. I followed him from a distance, using the pillars and the shadows cast by the torches as my allies. It was like playing a stealth video game, only in real life the boxes you hide in smell like mildew and there's no save button. He didn't go to the guest quarters. Instead, he went up a narrow, dark, spiral staircase. Every step of mine echoed more than I would have liked. I held my breath, climbing slowly, feeling the cold, damp stones under my modern and totally inadequate sneakers. The staircase ended at a heavy wooden door. Falkett pushed it open and went out. I waited a moment and peeked. He was on the battlements, the defensive walls of the castle. The cold night wind whistled up there, whipping his cloak. Below, the village was a cluster of faint points of light and shadows. It was the perfect place. Secluded, with a clear view of anyone approaching. Professional. Falkett didn't read the note. He stood there, looking out into the darkness, as if waiting for something. I hid behind a watchtower, my heart beating an anxious rhythm against my ribs. What was I doing? This was real espionage. The punishment for this wasn't a bad grade on a history test. It was something that usually involved axes or ropes. Then, another figure emerged from the darkness of the wall walk. It wasn't a noble, nor a guard. It was a man wearing the simple brown habit of a friar. A monk. Of course. It made perfect sense. My brain made the connections so fast I could almost smell smoke. If minstrels and troubadours were the perfect field agents, members of the clergy were their ideal counterparts. Monks, friars, priests, they too possessed an almost universal passport. They could travel between enemy fiefdoms under the pretext of pilgrimage, visits to monasteries, or church business. No one would dare impede the passage of a man of God. They were considered above the mundane disputes of men, which made them the perfect messengers for those very disputes. The friar approached Falkett. There were no greetings. Just a nod. They were here on business. The lady is punctual, the friar said, his voice low and deep, almost lost in the wind. She understands the risks, Falkett replied. He took the linen napkin from his doublet. He didn't hand it over immediately. The news from the bridge is the talk of the court. Your propaganda works well, Master Troubadour. The best lie is always wrapped in a half-truth, Falkett said, and I could feel the cynicism in his voice. The Count believes himself a lion. Let him roar in his golden cage. What says the lioness? The friar took the napkin. His nimble fingers unfolded it. He didn't read it. He seemed to already know what to look for. He ran his finger along one of the edges of the cloth. Ah, he said. The stitching. A red thread. The supply convoy for Montfort will leave from the south in 3 days, as expected. The garrison at the eastern bridge, their loyalty has been bought. The bridge will be undefended at dawn on the 3rd day. I froze. That wasn't gossip. It was top-level military intelligence. The Countess, the lioness, was betraying her own husband. She was passing vital information to his enemy, Baron de Montfort. And the troubadour, the great artist, was the intermediary. His propaganda song praising the Count was the perfect cover. While he was feeding his patron's ego in front of everyone, he was conspiring with his patron's wife behind his back. It was a masterpiece of betrayal and espionage. The troubadour was the perfect spy for 3 reasons. First, freedom of movement. He was an itinerant artist, expected to travel from court to court. His presence anywhere was normal. Second, access. He was welcome in the tavern as well as the castle. He could hear the rumors of the servants and the plans of the lords. Third, and most importantly, the perfect cover. Who would suspect a man whose profession was to sing songs of love and war? Art was his camouflage. Music was his code. The friar folded the napkin and tucked it into the depths of his habit. The reward will be left at the monastery of St. Peter, as usual. May the heavens bless the Baron's generosity, Falkett said, without a shred of sincerity. They were about to part ways. The friar turned to leave. The plan was perfect, the execution flawless. And it would have remained so, if not for a completely anachronistic physiological detail, my allergic rhinitis. The cold wind, the dust from the old stones, the stress, it was a fatal combination. I felt that familiar itch deep in my nose. I tried to hold it back. I held my breath, pinched my nose, prayed to all the saints I didn't know. But it was useless. The sneeze came. And it wasn't a discreet sneeze. It was a catastrophic explosion, an ACHOO, that echoed off the battlements like a cannon shot. Silence. The friar and the troubadour froze. Slowly, both turned their heads in the direction of my watchtower. Their faces were no longer those of an artist and a clergyman. They were those of two predators who had just heard a twig snap in the forest. Their eyes locked onto my shadow. I had seen too much. I had heard everything. And now, they knew someone was there. My exotic assistant status had just expired. My new title was Eyewitness. And in any era, especially this one, eyewitness is just a longer name for potential corpse. I needed to run. I needed to get out of there. I needed to find the damn book and get back to the safe smell of mildew and despair in my grandmother's basement. The game was over, and now, it was just a matter of survival. The sound of my own sneeze was still ringing in my ears when my instincts, finally awakened from their long hibernation, screamed a single, clear instruction: run. There wasn't a second of hesitation. I turned and shot off along the wall walk with the speed of a man who has just discovered that the punishment for eavesdropping is being turned into a sieve with a variety of sharp objects. Behind me, I heard the sound of feet running on stone. Master Falkett and the friar were no heavily armored guards, they were agile. One was used to an itinerant life, the other, to long pilgrim walks. They were faster than I expected. My only trump card was blind panic, which added a surprising fuel of adrenaline to my sedentary nerd legs. I tumbled down the spiral staircase, tripping over my own feet, almost rolling down the last few steps. I reached a corridor I didn't recognize. To the right, it led back to the Great Hall. To the left, it plunged into even greater darkness. I chose darkness. Always choose darkness. It's a terrible life strategy, but a great short-term escape tactic. I ran through cold corridors and silent galleries, past tapestries showing boar hunts that were much braver than I was. I had no idea where I was going. My only goal was to put as many doors and corners between me and the two men who undoubtedly wanted to have a very serious conversation with me about the importance of not listening to other people's conversations. I turned a corner abruptly and ran straight into a heavy oak door, with iron hinges that looked like they hadn't been opened since the castle was built. The ring handle didn't move. Locked. Great. I heard footsteps approaching. In desperation, I threw my shoulder against the door. It creaked, protested, but gave way with a loud crack. I threw myself inside, slammed the door behind me, and, with trembling hands, managed to drop the heavy wooden bar into place. Silence. Outside, I heard the footsteps run straight past the corridor. For now, I was safe. My heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my mouth. I leaned against the door, panting, and tried to take stock of the situation. I was in a dark room, reeking of dust and old parchment. Slivers of moonlight came through a high, barred window, illuminating just enough to reveal the environment. Shelves. Tall shelves, from floor to ceiling, crammed with scrolls of parchment and leather-bound books. I had locked myself in a library. Or an archive. For a nerd like me, it was like a frightened lamb hiding in a steakhouse. The irony was palpable. As I tried to calm my breathing, I took a step back from the door. And that's when my heel hit something on the floor. A heavy book that someone, centuries ago, had left out of place. I stumbled, and the book fell with a dull, familiar thud on the stone floor. The cracked leather cover fell open, revealing the yellowed pages. In the faint moonlight, I saw the illustrations. The concentric circles, the alchemical symbols, the notes made in an elegant and unmistakable Latin script. My legs gave way. On the floor of that forgotten library, in the middle of a medieval castle in France, there it was. Tempus Deviationum. How? How did it get here? It was my book, the one from my grandmother's basement. Had it followed me? Or is the book not a single object, but a constant that manifests wherever and whenever it's needed? Maybe another traveler had left it here ages ago. There was no time for theories. The important thing was that it was here. My passage back. On the other side of the door, I heard voices. They had realized I didn't run past. The footsteps were returning. "The door is barred," said a voice, Falkett's. A pounding began on the door. First, with a fist. Then, with something heavier, probably a shoulder. The old wood groaned. They were going to get in. With hands more shaky than ever, I knelt and flipped through the book desperately. Where was it? Where was the return spell? I had never needed it before, the trips always ended on their own. I flipped through the pages, past spells to witness volcanic eruptions and to converse with Greek philosophers. Useless. Then, on the inside back cover, I found it. It wasn't a complex spell. It was a single sentence, almost like a manufacturer's safety note. When time runs out and danger is upon you. The door shuddered with a violent blow. A crack appeared in the wood. Call for home, and the thread back shall be remade. I began to read aloud, my voice a hoarse, hurried whisper. Dolum rapido, ubi phylum nascitur. I return to home, where the thread is born. The room's door exploded into splinters. Falkett and the friar burst in, their faces a mask of fury in the gloom. The troubadour had a dagger in his hand. The friar, the heavy metal crucifix from his neck, now wielded like a weapon. They took a step towards me. But it was too late. The air around me began to hum, the smell of my grandmother's basement already invading my nostrils, overpowering the smell of the library's dust. A whirlwind of bluish light and shadows began to form around me. And in the distance, almost like a farewell, I heard the familiar sound of a laughing goat. The last thing I saw were the shocked, disbelieving faces of the spy and the messenger, as I dissolved before their eyes, leaving them alone in a dusty room with a broken door and absolutely no explanation. Bam! Landing. This time, on the cold concrete floor of the basement. The only light came from the bare bulb in the ceiling. The smell of mildew and despair was as comforting as a mother's hug. The book lay closed beside me. I was home. wearing a sweatshirt covered in medieval cobwebs. I stood up, my body aching in a way that only a desperate escape through a 12th century castle can provide. And I thought about the minstrels. Poor jongler or not, shouting the news for a bowl of soup in the village. And the sophisticated troubadour, Falkett, weaving glorious lies for his patron while selling his secrets in the shadows. The news, the propaganda, and the espionage. All done by men with stringed instruments. We think we invented the media, fake news, intelligence. We didn't invent anything. We just traded the loot for a smartphone. The songs for posts. The messages on napkins for encrypted emails. The essence, the human need to tell stories, to spread information, and to manipulate the truth, that never changes. I picked up the Temps Deviationum from the floor. This time, I swear, I'm going to lock it in a safe. I'm going to melt the key. I'm going to forget it exists. At least, until next week. After all, I still haven't read the chapter about pirates. And so, our historian returns. A little dirtier, maybe a little wiser, and with a new appreciation for basic sanitation. We hope this adventure was a good escape for your mind. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and be thankful you don't have a medieval spy trying to turn you into a sieve. May your dreams be peaceful, and your nights safe. Good night.